by now you're working through that 10-part tutorial, which is a very key thing that I've asked you to work on right at the beginning of the course here. But I'm going to go through kind of my own interpretation or not interpretation, my own discussion of a lot of the materials that are going to cover in that tutorial, just so I can give you my own sort of slant and take on things, right? So we're going to start off with a brand new project here, right? So what do we want to do? Well, make sure that you're getting the right kind of project. I usually type the word model, and then that will help filter out here. So we'll get with all the different project types, we should be able to come up with the one that I'm after here, the model view controller design pattern, right? So ASP.NET Core web app using model view controller. Okay, probably you want to make sure you pick C sharp. I mean, F sharp's a good language too, but we're learning C sharp at the moment. So that's the correct template that we want to base our project on. So I'll just click next. Now I'm going to put it in my work folder, but not in that particular subfolder. Okay, I just put it in sqLite my work. Let me talk about that for a moment. Um, there's nothing wrong with doing the project in other locations. However, there are some spots in the file system which can be problematic. Even the desktop sometimes, if that is being synchronized as part of your OneDrive and so on and so forth, it can occasionally lead to some issues. So I usually encourage students to be guaranteed of a safe, interruption-free development environment. I usually do something like this. I'll create a folder right off the root of my C drive or my main working hard drive, and that's where I'll put my work. Now, what you're losing with that is it's not automatically being backed up. You have to make sure you save it, back it up regularly yourself, right? But on the other hand, there's nothing interfering with you as you're working here. So that's what I do. And then, copy it, back it up every once in a while on your own, right? Okay. Project name. I know that we're past COVID. At least most of us are hoping we are. However, uh, for this demonstration, we're going to make a little application for managing our collection of masks, right? You never know. These new variants coming up, we might just actually have to start wearing masks again. So don't throw them out. We're going to make a little application here to keep track of our masks. Okay, it's kind of silly, but it's really just a demo anyway, right? Okay, so we're using right now .NET 7, okay, standard term support. I would encourage you at this point in time, we're going to select individual accounts, right? What that does for us is it puts into the project right from the beginning a bunch of templates and classes and so on that are available to help us manage logins, users, and so on and so forth. And since we're going to be eventually implementing all of that, we might as well start with that in place. We'll configure for HTTPS for now, although I'll be showing you later on how you can turn that on and off if it's a problem for you. When we publish it to Azure, of course, we'll definitely be using HTTPS so that only secure connections will be allowed, right? So that's it. That's all the options we need for now. So I'll click Create, and we'll wait for that to finish baking. All right, there we go. So now we're up and running. So it's, some links here to some good information on building your app and so on and so forth. Feel free to look at that. Let me just come back over here. We're just going to do a bit of a tour before we go any further. Now, model view controller. By now you've read about it. Okay, you read the references I put up and so on. So let me point out that using this project template, not surprisingly, we see models, views, and controllers, right? So one of the things I want to emphasize about this system is to our great advantage that it follows what we often refer to as convention over configuration. In other words, instead of having a million things all set in configuration files, we can just simply follow some naming conventions. And that makes our life much, much easier, right? So for example, if I go into controllers here, we see that there is a home controller, right? Now, the controller, as we know, is like the conductor. Okay, it gets data from the models and then displays it in the views, right? And it looks after all that flow of information through the system, right? So if a request comes in for the home index action, right? Notice it just says return view. Well, how is the system supposed to know what view? I mean, you're going to discover that you actually, in the overloads, you can name a particular view to be used, right? But we don't need to worry about that with the mapping that we have. we have controller slash view and then slash an ID. That's the default. We'll look at that in a few moments here. But for now, let me just talk about this naming convention. So with the home controller, if we go slash home in the URL that we're coming to, by default, index is the uh, default action. So we don't even have to say slash index, and it will just go to that automatically. Then when we say return view, well, let's come over here to views. If I expand it, look at that. There's folders here. So if it's the home controller, it's going to look for a view inside the home folder. Simple as that, right? Well, what views do we have here? We have two. We have index and privacy. And that corresponds to these two actions that you see here, these action results. So that's why we don't actually have to name the view. Coming here, if it came to privacy and we return view, it would look for this particular view here, the privacy CS HTML. By that way, the CS HTML, CS of course is for C sharp, HTML meaning that this is part of an HTML page at the very least. In fact, let's have a quick look here at index, okay? CS HTML, right? Ooh, look at that. That little at symbol, notice it's even highlighted in yellow. That's an example of that other reference I gave you is to read through the syntax for using Razor, in other words, C sharp code in your HTML itself, right? So there's a little snippet of Razor code here. And what are we doing inside it? We're setting view data, okay, value title equal to, or name title equal to homepage, right? Now, all view data is, and view bag is basically the same idea. View data is a collection of name value pairs, right? So that is what we have. We have a name, okay? The name is title, the value is homepage, and we're setting that into our view data collection as we then prepare this snippet of HTML to be incorporated into what is seen on the screen. Now, I emphasize snippet because you notice it's not a complete web page. Whereas the head and the body tags and so on and so forth, the things you learned right back in term one are absolutely required to be a valid web page, right? Well, that all comes from somewhere else. A common page that we use as the layout for all of our views, unless, well, actually we have the option of having multiple layouts and we can change which one we want to use. But most of the time, we're just going to be using the one. Well, how does that work? Well, let's come down here, right, to view start. View start in defines that our default layout is this partial view right here, underscore layout. By the way, the underscore at the beginning of a name for a view is just a convention that we use to indicate that it is a partial view, right? Well, where is that found? Well, back here in views again, here's shared. So these are ones that are shared across all. Remember, home refers to the home controller. As we add more controllers, each controller will have its own folder of views under the views folder eventually, right? We just have home for now. Shared views, on the other hand, are shared across all controllers, right? And look, that's where we find our layout. So if I look in layout, underscore layout, now that looks better, right? That looks like a regular full-blown HTML page. We have our doc type at the top, okay? Language, our head, our body, et cetera, right? All this good stuff is all incorporated there. So this is our standard layout page. That's the way we're using it. Okay, as I said, you can add separate layout pages if you wanted to, but we're just going to use the one for now. Okay, and typically, as we see in the head section, look at that. We have some links here for style sheets, right? Through the tutorial, you've already learned that, of course, by default, we're set up here to use Bootstrap, which is a great CSS tool that helps us give a consistent look and feel to the style of our whole website, right? So we'll be talking more about Bootstrap and how we work with it later on. But the general idea is we go and we get a copy of this Bootstrap file from the Bootstrap resource online, right? And then, as a general rule, you don't go in and you don't change anything. If you want to make a change, override one of the styles and so on that's part of the CSS, usually we'll put that into our own site CSS because we're appending it, and we can say, no, when we ask for this, we're going to do it this way instead of the standard Bootstrap approach, right? We can even add our own styles here and so on and so forth. So that's all in the head section. As we come down into the body, you see we have a header. Well, we saw that in our demo I was showing you the other day that we have a navigation bar and it's already got the built-in capability utilizing Bootstrap to, automatically change so that on a mobile device it gives you like a drop-down menu system as opposed to all the little buttons across the top. As if you have a larger screen size, that's what you get and so on and so forth. So that's why there's some collapsing going on as you see here and so on and so forth, right? Okay, but also in the navigation bar, you see that we have some links here, right? We have two navigation links. One goes to this particular controller home index, and then also home privacy. We'll talk more about area later on. In a very large application, you might break things down into separate areas as well. I'll tell you right now, for the most part, this entire term, we won't really have a need for having separate areas, although it is always an option, right? So basically, just focus on controller and action. So this ties again back into that convention versus configuration I was talking about. Okay, just by giving the name to the controller, we know which controller it will go to, and then of course, whatever the action is, we'll then know what view to use, all automatically just following the naming conventions, right? Okay, oh, here's another something interesting. Here's how we insert into this full web page here, so to speak, another partial view, right? This is the login partial. Well, where is that? It's as well shared, right? And here's where we get those links that appear in the upper right corner that you noticed before. Here's our register and login links, okay? So if we aren't signed in, this is the code that displays register and login. If we already are signed in, okay, then it'll show us a link here for managing hello, knowing who is logged in. That's the user, okay, their identity, their name, right? Otherwise, we also have a link here to go back to the home index. Okay. All right. So that is how this partial view gets inserted into the layout right here. And we're going to be doing that kind of work on our own later on. All right. Now let me draw your attention to this div in particular. Here's our main, okay, inside the body here. Here's the main container, right? That contains the actual body of the web page. So this render body, whenever we ask for a view, okay, knowing that it's going to use our layout, the view is inserted right here, right? So our index CSHTML, right? Remember here we set the title equal homepage. Well, back in our layout then, okay, it's in the data. So up here in the title, right in the head section of our layout, notice we have the @ symbol. So this is Razor code again, view data title. So depending on what view we're showing in this common layout page, that title will be included here. So the title for our index is homepage. So when we run this, what we'll see, it'll say homepage dash mask demo, right? Now, if you want, you can start fixing up things like that right away, put a little space in there and so on. Same over here, right? And down in the footer, right, here's a reference as well to mask demo, copyright, et cetera, there. Okay, so I'm just kind of giving you a quick walkthrough here of how all this ties together, how the view then will automatically load our layout page that view start identifies, okay, in our layout page, the body of the view itself gets rendered here, right? Notice a bit comes after it, there's a footer, right? And then of course at the end we have all of our scripts, okay? So we're using jQuery and Bootstrap, and notice that down here, we even have, right? Oh, of course, we can add our own custom JavaScript in here as well. But there's also this render section. Okay, this is Razor code. So basically, later on, we'll be doing this. We'll be creating our own scripts or adding our own script sometime to the script available on a single page, right? You know, if there's something we need on every page, well, then we just put it in site.js, our own code, right? But what if it's something that's only needed on one particular page, okay, or maybe a couple different ones? Then we can add it to a script section on a page, on a view, right? And then it'll get rendered in here, okay? Because what it will do is it'll look for a section named scripts and render it, right? Later on, we'll even add the same type of thing for sections for CSS, and we'll put that up in here in the head. All right, so hopefully I haven't confused you. I'm just kind of walking you through how the layout of these pages work. All right. Um, Now let's have a look at something else. If I just double click on mass demo, this opens the CS prog file, okay? And what do we see in here? Well, here's our target framework is .NET 7. We're going to come back and talk about this in a moment, but you notice that there's a number of other settings in here. I want to draw your attention to all these package references, right? So we already have packages now. A number of these were only added, okay? These two that mention identity, they were only added because we checked off that checkbox as we built this project, right? To include individual user accounts, right? So that uses the ASP.NET Core Identity System, right? And that is why these are here. And at the same time, it added these two, right? Because knowing that we're going to track logins, users, and passwords, well, then we need to store that somewhere. So it assumes right off the beginning that we're going to be using SQL Server through Entity Framework Core. And then this tools package is a tools that work for any database, not just SQL Server, but they're tools that extend the capability of Entity Framework Core working with any database, right? So that all got added, all four of these, because we checked off that one checkbox, okay? Notice they're all using the same version here of .NET 7, right? And that's perfectly good. Now, I'll mention some packages we add won't necessarily have this version. They might be different version numbers. In fact, if you just do an install package, then by default, you get the latest and greatest version that's available, right? Sometimes we do want to select an earlier one, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Before I leave this file, though, I want to point out this fairly recent feature added to C Sharp, and you've probably run into this in your other classes already, but I'm going to mention it here because I always come in and change this. Nullable, okay? The idea is that with reference types, it probably would have been a good idea from the very beginning to make them so that they can't be null, right? uh, so basically, no, we don't want to do it. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. We want to disable this. Now, I could just delete it, right? I could just delete this whole line and it would have the same effect. Or I could just change this to disable, right? And that way it's more consistent with how we've been doing our C sharp work in the past, okay? So we don't actually have to specify that something is nullable, for example, and then we can actually just assume that an int won't be null until we make it nullable, right? So it's just more consistent with the way we've been working in the past. Okay, all right, so I'm done with that. I'm just going to save that change. I'll close that file. And let's, before we move on, talk a bit about what do we see under areas here. Okay, ooh, that's where we've scaffolded all these views. Well, technically they're pages, not views, for the identity system. Now, most of them are actually compiled and not available for us. We could install them all so we could make changes to them, and we'll do that later on in the course. Okay, but all we really have right now is this view start here for the identity system. Okay, all right, but this is where we'll actually then add pages that we'll modify to change how the login system works, right? At the same time that the identity system was added here under data, yes, we are finally going to get to that third of our model view controller, okay? The model is all contained here in the data folder. This would be empty. In fact, we wouldn't even have this folder if there wasn't the option, again, selected to add the identity system, right? Because it expects that we're going to actually have to work with SQL Server. So what it has given us is some migrations. Now you've already been reading through our tutorials that this term, unlike last term where we did a lot of work in the database, we even created all those standard stored procedures and saw how we could use them on the client side with tools like Dapper or other tools as well to use the database tables and views, etc., inside the database. Well, here we don't start with the database, right? Doing code first development, we start with our model. And then we actually have it generate the database and all the objects in the database based on our model, right? So it's a total reversal in the approach to develop, right? So what we have here is an application DB context. So this is defining it inherits from identity DB context, which inherits from, by the way, DB context, right? Which we'll be using ourselves in a few moments, okay? The identity DB context has already models in place and code in place to support the identity system. All right, so not too much to look at in here. This is really just uh, a stub to get everything in place. What I did want to show you here is our first. Notice the date timestamp is all zeros. That's what is in front of this name, create identity schema. So if you haven't looked at it before, here's a chance to see how Code First Migrations works in terms of describing what we're going to do inside the database. So this is a migration builder create table, right? So this is essentially a C# way of writing a create table statement, you might say. Okay, we give the name for the table, we define the columns, right? ID, name, normalized name, concurrency stamp. So these are all in the data types being used and so on. Now this is all C#. So what actually happens in the end is we write this with C#, and when we call it to update the database, it actually will generate for us the SQL. Yes, for those of you that hate writing SQL, you're probably sitting there going, yay, because this will write the SQL for me. Yeah, that's what code first development is. Instead of writing the create table statements in SQL, okay, we just use this code. And you know what? Even this code we don't have to write. The tools will actually generate this based on our model, right? So we see we have a number of tables here. We have a ASP.NET users table, right, with all these things, names, emails, password, hashes, and so on. Phone numbers, two-factor enable, right? That all gets created inside the database, and away we go, right? And so on, all the way through. So this is, of course, written in just in a specific way for SQL Server because that's what it expects to use at this point in time. All right, so these are all the tables that will be part of that identity system. Now, let me come back up to the top here. I just want to point out here, this is all part of the up. Notice that there's a down, okay? Migrations work this way. There's always an up and a down. Downside to every upside. No, basically, because we can move forward through a series of migrations and then roll back through them as well. So in that way, they're kind of like a transaction, right? So we can go forward, apply a migration, we can roll it back, and in that case, we execute the down as opposed to the up. Now, what's in the down? Basically, we see a whole bunch of drop table, drop table, drop table, and so on, right? So inside the up, we have a bunch of create tables. And of course, along with them, we sometimes add indexes and things like that specifically. But all we have to do to roll back this migration is to drop all the tables that we created, right? So the idea of code first migrations is that we can do a migration that takes the current state of the model, writes this code for us that will then be interpreted into SQL to actually synchronize the database. The database has tables, properties, fields, etc., to match the actual model, right? Okay, so that's good. So that's what we're going to do in a few minutes. We're going to do that ourselves for our own models instead, right? So I'll maybe just clean up the screen a little bit here, and then we'll get ready to actually go on to actually building something of our own.